We're going to continue in our series in the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. Follow along with me as I read. Luke 6, 1 through 11. Now it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating the grain. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread which is not lawful for any to eat except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions? And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath he entered the synagogues and was teaching, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew that what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he got up and came forward. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it?" After looking around at them all, he said to them, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. May God add the blessing to the reading of his word. We're going to be looking at three specific points here today. Have you not? Is it? And then response. Have you ever been told to do something, and when you did it, you missed the whole reason and purpose for doing it? I know I have. Where you were told to do something, and you're thinking that it's for one thing, but then, and as you do it, and you get it done, you miss the whole purpose behind it. Often, that happens with many people, is that, like teachers, for example, when they're teaching, they have a purpose in the lesson in which they're trying to teach. And when they do it, they have a certain specific purpose in mind. And so the students, when they're hearing what's going on with the lesson, some get it, but some completely miss the whole point and purpose behind it. And that's the same way it is with Jesus even today. There's more to it than we see on the surface. There's a greater purpose behind what he wants us to see. And often we do things because we're told to do it. And then we miss the reason and the purpose behind it. But today we're going to find out, as Jesus was looking in it, Jesus was about his Father's business. And when some religious individuals question him on keeping the law, Jesus shows them the true spirit of the law, and yet they respond in anger. And so the reality is that Jesus is trying to teach them a certain lesson and certain meanings, and he's going to show them the reason and the purpose, the real reason and purpose for what they're doing. And so often, so that we don't miss that point. Okay, our first point, have you not? Now it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on the Sabbath, and the disciples were picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. Okay, so it's really important here that we look at context of what we're doing. It's what day of the week? It's the Sabbath. It says, now on the Sabbath, it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a Saturday. If you look at the commands, in the Ten Commandments, it says, keep the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So the idea there is that, well, I can't do anything on the Sabbath. That means I can't often do anything. And what will happen is that people will take that to the nth degree, and they'll say, you can't do anything. And so you can't cook, you can't eat, you can't walk your dog, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so people interpret that as something that you cannot do anything. Of course you can eat and breathe, but that's it. And so the reality is that there's a greater meaning and there was a greater purpose here behind the Sabbath. And that's what Jesus was going to try and teach them. So as they were walking along, Jesus and his disciples are walking along with them, and they're hungry. And so they see some grain fields along the road, which often would be, in that time and culture, because in an agricultural culture, you would see fields of grains along the road. And so they were taking the heads off, and they were rubbing them between their fingers, and they were eating them because they were hungry. Now, some people were looking at that as, well, they're hungry and they just needed to get something to eat. Now, the law permitted them that you could eat. In other words, you could take the grains. If you're hungry, you could take the grains off the top of the grains, and you could eat them, and you wouldn't be breaking the law. But the Jews at this time, as we're going to find out, interpret that completely different. So what they were saying is that, and eating the grain. Some of the Pharisees says, why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? So the Pharisees were the religious leaders who added to the law. In other words, they went beyond what God intended them to do. They added things that were already to the law, which weren't originally there. They added things that should not have been there. So they interpreted that they came to Jesus, and their real motive was they were looking to find something against Jesus. That's their real motive. Their motive wasn't pure because they were breaking the law. There was an ulterior motive that was going on there that they wanted to do to find out about Jesus. So how are we going to get something on Jesus? Well, we'll get them on breaking the law. And so here his disciples are hungry, and now they're feeding themselves from the grain, and they interpret that as work. The law said the Jewish law said you couldn't work on the Sabbath. In other words, you had to take a rest. It was a time for rest. And so they interpreted them taking the grains off the top of the wheat and eating it as work. They looked at it as harvesting, when in reality all they were doing was just eating because they were hungry. And so can you see the difference when people look at when you're doing something, and they look at the purpose of the law? The purpose the purpose of the Sabbath was so you can get rest, so you don't do work. But if you're hungry and you need to eat, then breaking the law to get something to meet a need is okay. But some people don't look at it that way. They're looking at, this is the law and you can't do anything, and this is the way it is. And even Jesus wasn't even doing anything. But Jesus goes on here, he tells a story. Well, what about David? Have you not read? In other words, he's reminding them, and the religious leaders who knew the law, who knew the Bible, who knew everything about the Bible, it says, have you not read? And there was a story about David, where this was before he was king, and how he went into the holy place where the priests were, and he ate the consecrated bread, which was only for the priests to eat, because he and his men were hungry. And they were meeting a need. And they should have done that because the law says only the priests could eat the bread. But here David is, what? He's not a priest, but he wasn't even the king at that point. He was just one of the people who was trying to become king eventually. But the reality is that David was breaking law, but Jesus said it was okay. Why? Because there was a genuine need there. And what happens is that what God is saying is that when there's a genuine need that's being met, it's okay to do what? To break the law. Isn't it? Think about it. Are you doing it purposely to break the law, the Jewish law? Or are you doing it so that you can meet the need and you can satisfy the need? And the reality was that's what David was doing. Look at David. He and his companions were hungry. And so he went in and took the bread. But he says, and what they were thinking was, he knew what they were thinking. says, but you're not David. But then Jesus goes on here and says, listen to this. And it says, and he was saying to them, it says, and Jesus answered him and said, have you not read what David did? And then go down to verse 5, and he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, Jesus knew what they were thinking, and Jesus was saying that he's even greater than David because he's God alone, and he's Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who created the law. He's over the law. And he can do with the law what he so fits, what he sees as the right way of interpreting the law. I'm Lord over the law. I'm Lord over everything. I'm Lord over the Sabbath. I'm Lord over these rituals and these things that you have set up. I'm Lord over all that. So I can do with it what I want. And what the purpose of Jesus was saying was that he was Lord, that he was God, and that he was over the law, but also it's saying that there's a need that when need is present, it supersedes the law. In other words, and I, for example, like years and years ago, I grew up in a town, I grew up in a neighborhood where there was towns around me where they were called blue laws, where the towns on Sunday, you couldn't do anything on a Sunday. There was no stores open, there was nothing, and so you couldn't do anything. And what happened, the whole purpose of that was the blue law was so that you could get rest. But some people interpreted and took that beyond the level of, it was based on religious belief, it was based on, taking rest on the Sabbath. But what the whole purpose was, that they missed it, was that people couldn't do anything. And they were looking at people not being able to do anything on the Sabbath. And I think what happens is that people, it's not just the Sabbath, like the day of rest, but it's anything. When you do something, when God has something in place, tells you a commandment that's not in place, and says, well, what happens is that often we condemn other people for breaking those commandments or things that we think are not right. And we do that. I do that sometimes too. Is that we look at people and they're not doing what the Bible says. They're not doing this, and they're not doing this, and they're not doing this. And there may be a reason for it that is a perfectly legitimate reason, and there shouldn't be any condemnation in that. And that's what we need to be aware of. That the whole purpose of God's law is so that there's parameters and there's guidelines and there's things that direct us towards Him and to make us like Him. Not to stifle us in our relationship with Him. If there's a legitimate need that needs to be met, like you can't prepare a meal on the Sabbath, that's ridiculous. But some people, because some people's schedule can't do it. I'll give you an example. It tells us about taking a Sabbath rest. I can't take Sunday as my Sabbath rest, can I? Because that's when Christians generally do that. Can I? If I'm a pastor, I'm working, all right? Right? But some people will say, well, you're not resting on the Sabbath, which we consider Sunday. And so reality is that it's the spirit behind the law. Is that we have to look at what's really the intent of the law. What's really the intent behind the commandment. What's really the intent behind what God is telling us to do. Not just the plain black and white letter of the law. You need to look behind what God's purpose and meaning is behind it. We cannot miss that. We cannot miss, it's not the letter of the law, because we often look at the letter of the law, don't we? And this is what the letter of the law says. Rather than do what? Rather than look at the spirit of the law, what's behind the law, what God had intended. Right? And because think about that, because we can't be so, and I'm really guilty of this too, because I become so ritualistic. I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. Rather than looking at the spirit behind it. And what is the real motivation behind doing what God commands us to do? What is the real motivation behind it? Is it love? Because that's ultimately what it is, because the commandments are what? Are summed up in two things. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the real spirit of the law. That's the spirit of the law. And that's the operation that we should be operating in our lives as Christians, rather than just solely just keeping the law for the sake of keeping the law because it's an obligation, because it's this, and because this, rather than it being motivated at doing it out of love. And if there's a genuine human need that needs to be met, and the law is going to be broken, meeting the need of the individual is going to be more important than solely breaking the law. And then just saying, well, you broke the law, you can't do it. That's what the religious leaders were doing. And they didn't operate out of love, they operate out of condemnation. The opposite of love is condemnation. It is. Because we look down and we condemn others because they're not doing what we think is right. Rather than saying, okay, maybe there's a reason why they're not doing it. Are they doing it because I can't, I need to feed my family. I need to work on Sunday. I can't be at church on Sunday because, the scripture says, let us not forsake the assembling together of the brethren. Well, I can't be at church on Sunday because I have to work. Well, I have to feed my family. You going to condemn a person for wanting to feed his family? There's another verse where it says, if anyone does not provide for his family, he's worse than an unbeliever. So if he's not, so there's a double standard there. If he's not providing for his family, the man's not providing for his family, are you going to condemn him for that too? But he has to work on Sunday because that's the only job he could get? So the reality is that we have to, our motivation for looking at people and judging people should not be based on out of just strictly condemnation, but it should be based on love, shouldn't it? And understanding, and seeing what's behind that person. Many churches, it's sad to say, I hate to say this, but I've been part of churches where they condemn people because they weren't doing things the way they said they should be doing. Rather than looking at the spirit of the law and the intent of the law, which is love, right? And meeting the need of the individual. Like in this case, Jesus and his disciples were hungry. They needed to eat, didn't they? Yeah. Same thing with us. If there's a need and we're breaking the law, I'm not saying like stealing stuff. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is there's, within reason, simple things. Is that God says, look behind the spirit of the law. And what is it say, what is he really saying here? And what is he really doing here? Well, let's go on here because we need to continue on here. It says, verses 6 through 10. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man whose right hand had been withered. And listen to this. As Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. So did they really notice that the man had medical needs here? Did they really notice that? What were they really focused on? They were really focused on looking for a reason to condemn Jesus. They didn't see that the man had need. There was no love there, was there? For this man, the man who had need? Was there? There wasn't. They didn't focus on that. They didn't care an inkling about that man. All they were concerned about was condemning Jesus. And we need to be careful about that. Because if a person has a need, and we miss the whole need of the person and their need being met, then you miss the whole purpose of the law, which is love. Love from a pure heart. And so, what happens, for example, if someone was sick, and, well, you can't go to work on Sunday because it's a Sabbath, but someone's sick in the hospital, and that's the only day you can go to the hospital. Are you not going to go to the hospital because it's a Sabbath and you have to rest? And it's the only day you can do it? Think about it. That's reality. But that's the depth of what it is that we need to go beyond what we see on the surface. And we need to go deeper behind what God is saying in His law. And the scribes and the Pharisees were watching Him closely. But He knew what they were thinking, because Jesus is God, right? He knows what everyone's thinking. And He knows the motivation. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he got up and came forward. This man operated in what? In faith. But Jesus was concerned. He knew this man. He knew this man before he was even born. He knew him while he was yet in his mother's womb. Read Psalm 139. He can tell you all about that. And the reality is that Jesus was concerned about this man and his need to be healed. And so He didn't care what the Pharisees or the teachers of the law were thinking. It was the Sabbath. This was another Sabbath day. And He wanted to see this man healed, even though it was on the Sabbath. Now, was He going to wait till the next day and come to the man and say, "Okay, you can come back tomorrow and get healed"? Now, how ludicrous does that sound? How ridiculous does that sound? Think about that. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be understanding of what God is really saying. If someone needs prayer, if someone needs, let's say, for example, like on Sunday morning, when somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, Pastor, you can pray for me." So I can't because I'm working, because it's work. Come back, call me in the week, and I'll pray for you. Right? Think about it. The reality is that we need to understand the truth behind everything that God commands us to do, because there's a reason for it. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or destroy it?" So He's asking a rhetorical question here. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it? So is it lawful to break God's law if it's going to save a life, or if a person's life is going to be healed? Is it lawful? I'll give you a great, perfect example. I don't know if you're aware of this. Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place. Now, the Bible says, "Do not lie." Right? Doesn't it? We all know that one. That's a basic commandment that everybody knows. Now, she and her family were devout Christians in Holland during World War II. And they made a room in their house where they hid Jews from the Nazis. And when the Nazis would come knocking on the door, they would ask them, "Do you have any Jews in here?" "No." "But they're Christians." They lied. Didn't they? But what were they lying for? What were they lying about? Protecting a life. Saving a life. Saving lives. And how many countless Jews did He save? They eventually got caught. But the reality is that they lied. But the lying was for what? The purpose of what? Saving a life, wasn't it? And see, the whole purpose of the law was not just to do it for the sake of doing it. The purpose of the law and the purpose of God's commandments are given so that we can motivate and love. And so love would say, well, I'm going to protect these people who are actually God's people, the Jews. And I'm going to protect them even if I have to lie to do it. Not saying you go around and you lie all the time, but sometimes there's reasons why we have to do things, break God's law or God's command, in order to protect or save a life, isn't it? What did Rahab the harlot do in the Old Testament when Joshua and his spies were coming in? I mean, when they were going to surround in Jericho, what did she do? There were some spies that came in, and she hid them in her house. And then some people from Jericho came and said, "Do you know where the spies are? We think we saw you coming in here." I said, "I don't know. I think they just left, and I think they went north." Or they were actually hidden in the room somewhere there. And so she lied to them. But if you look in Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about Rahab being one of the heroes of faith. But she lied. How could she be a hero of faith if she lied? Think about it. She broke the law. How could she be here? But she was doing it in faith, and she was doing it what? To protect God's people, because there was a promise there that she knew and she believed that they were God's people, and God was going to give them that land. And so the reality is that we need to be aware and we need to be cognizant of when we need to, it's okay to be able to break God's commands, to be able to not do God's commands. And if it's to help people, by all means. If it's to help people or help somebody in need, by all means. And we need to have the wisdom and the understanding from the Lord to be able to do it. But listen here. But the Pharisees couldn't see it. And because they couldn't see it, they got what? After looking around, and this is my last point, is their response. But they themselves were filled, verse 11, were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. In another book of another gospel, it goes that they might find a way to kill Jesus. So they were so enraged. But the idea when I was doing my study here was, it was a nonsensical rage. It was like, you ever see somebody that was so mad, it just made no sense. It just made no sense. It was like they were just like they were like literally crazy mad. You ever see that? I have. It just made no sense why they were mad that way. They didn't even know why they were mad that way. But Jesus brought them to the point where they were so mad because He got over on them. Because He showed them really what they were all about. And He showed them the reality of God's truth. But let us look at one thing here, though, is that for us, if someone shows us the right way to go, and shows us the right way to do things, should we respond in anger? How should we respond? Say, okay, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. Responding in humility. And responding in what? In love. So, as we look at this, God has the ultimate understanding of His law. We must seek His wisdom to best know how to apply it. God knows His law because He's the one who wrote it. But we need to seek His understanding of what the law is saying, of what His commandments are saying. We need to seek His understanding on it. What is God? What are you saying here? What are you really doing here? Is it to keep the law just for this, keep this commandment just for the sake of keeping the commandment? But God, what are you really saying here? Well, you need to seek His understanding. We just can't automatically go on tradition. We can't automatically go on ritual. We have to seek His understanding. Number 2, it says, once you have the proper understanding of His commands, you do what's right in His sight. In other words, once you have understanding, if there's a need that needs to be met in that particular moment or that situation, go ahead and meet the need. But you need to do what's right. Not just keep the law for the sake of keeping the law, but do what's right. Even if it means breaking the law where it's not going to hurt somebody. I'm not saying go out and steal some food for some people if they're hungry. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if there's a need that needs to be met, do the need, meet the need, and take care of the individual. And respond in a godly manner, in humility and love, not in anger. Just because you think they're not doing what you think is right. Respond in humility, respond in love. And that's ultimately the bottom line, guys, is that the law is built on love. And that's how we should respond when we're doing God's commands and we're doing what He calls us to do. And it's so important, guys, because the reality is people don't need to see condemnation. Who's the one who condemns us? It's the enemy. Condemnation comes from the enemy. What does the Scripture say? There's now no more condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. He's the accuser of the brethren. And all that comes from the enemy. It comes from Satan. But the reality is that we need, as believers, not to respond in condemnation. We need to respond in love. Because love is the ultimate response. That's the way Jesus would do things. And we need to look at things on a deeper level so that we can respond to people, and so they can come to know Christ. Because when we respond in love and we do what God tells us to do, and we meet those human needs, what happens is that people respond to that comfort. They don't respond to condemnation. Actually, it drives people away. But love draws people, doesn't it? Real, genuine, Christ-like, genuine love draws people. It doesn't condemn. And that's how God wants us to respond. Amen?